Next up is Craig McLuckie. He is the Vice President of R&D for VMware Tanzu. Craig is actually one of two Kubernetes founders. Both Craig McLuckie and Joe Beda work for VMware. He recently joined VMware through the Heptio acquisition as the CEO and co-founder of the company. Heptio was a startup that helped enterprises adopt Kubernetes. And prior to that, he worked at Google, where he co-founded the Kubernetes project, was responsible for the formation of CNCF, an open source software foundation, and was the original product lead for the Google Compute Engine.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to get a chance to chat to folks. So obviously, in my role, I spend a lot of time talking about Kubernetes. I'm actually getting a little bit tired of talking about Kubernetes. And it's really exciting to be working through the lens of Tanzu to have access to some really interesting, exciting technologies. And I think you've got a series of introductions to the Tanzu portfolio from a variety of folks on our side. What I'd like to do now is just take a few minutes to talk through how to really think about this. What makes me most excited about it? What's really relevant for enterprise organizations that are embarking on this journey towards cloud native? Let's jump in. So first slide, please. So the starting point here is, and I always like to say this, like we're no longer your grandfather's VMware. Like we're really starting to look at this world that bridges what teams need that are embarking on a digital application or a digital transformation journey with the underlying infrastructure that they use. And there's a number of really strong assets that we have in our portfolio. Obviously, VMware is known as an infrastructure company. And there's a lot of folks like to say, your software doesn't run on software, it actually runs on infrastructure. And that's why we work so closely with our friends at Dell to make sure that what we bring to the world is a very well harmonized and very well integrated story. And obviously, the plank of that is the SDDC investments we've made with vSphere. But increasingly, we're making significant advances in this Kubernetes ecosystem. So we've talked a lot about Kubernetes as being an anchor for much of what shows up in the Tanzu environment. And the work that we've done to bring Kubernetes into vSphere is really important. But it's also worth recognizing the work that we've done to advance Kubernetes itself as a technology that can be consumed in a very broad array of environments. VMware is emerging as a very strong contributor to the Kubernetes ecosystem. And the work that we're doing is really not only advancing Kubernetes, but advancing our customers' needs as they're walking on this journey. And it's also about having something to talk about beyond Kubernetes. In my previous roles where I was often an ambassador for the community and often spent a lot of time helping enterprise organizations adopt it, it became very clear that there was this gulf that existed when you went to an application team, when you went to a line of business team. Yes, it's great to present this wonderful piece of API-driven infrastructure, but how do you actually get progressive applications built on it? How do you modernize your middleware capabilities? And what we've brought into the portfolio with the pivotal acquisition is things like Spring, which is an anchor for progressive Java development. If you look at it, Spring is being used by almost every enterprise organization that has a Java footprint, and becomes a very important part of the story. So the question is, how do we bring that more naturally into this ecosystem? If you look at capabilities like the Tanzu application service, that is an anchor for a lot of enterprise organizations that are looking to get a superhighway from the developer's IDE into the production environment. And the work that we're doing here, next slide, please, is really bringing this all together. And so I think about this from the lens of what do application teams need from their infrastructure? Agile teams need more intrinsically agile infrastructure. How do we make that infrastructure technology available to them in a way that supports their mission? And how do we complement that with a set of capabilities that make their day-to-day jobs easier, both from the development perspective and also from the operations perspective? Next slide, please. And so the way I like to look at this, and when you think about Tanzu, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach the Tanzu portfolio. You can really look at it from the infrastructure up perspective. What does it take to provide my infrastructure in a way that's more naturally consumable by teams, that has a lot of those desirable attributes of kind of API centricity, more intrinsic elasticity, the ability to support self-service provisioning of a variety of different services. But you can also look at it from the top down. And Tanzu is really about that bridge. The starting point for us, as I mentioned, is obviously Kubernetes. So when you look at the work that we've done to bring Kubernetes to vSphere, it's not just about making Kubernetes an upstream rendition of Kubernetes, which is that Tanzu Kubernetes grid capability accessible to organizations that are running vSphere. We've actually baked it really deeply into the system, so that that becomes now an interface that you can use to not only deliver some of these progressive technologies, but you can also link them with a lot of those things that you're running today. So we expect our customers to have custom VM workloads running for some time. The question is really, how do you make those custom VM workloads work well with some of these cloud native capabilities? How do you bring that together? And the work that we've done in VCF in the private cloud space is really leading into that space. Now, another area of incredible interest to organizations, and this is becoming something that I'm extremely excited to be working with Dell friends around, is how do we take that out to the edge? You know, Kubernetes represents this effective environment that supports the ability to operate and update and maintain a very broad cross-section of software capabilities with an as-a-service flavor. Now, how do we take that Tanzu experience to the edge? So it's not just about getting your infrastructure ready to run that application, but how do we actually deliver the supply chain that brings the application into that environment? And to be able to accomplish that, it's not just about Kubernetes. It's also about how do I effectively build a container image? What is the registry that is honed in? How do I think about the continuous integration and delivery mechanics that get it there? How do I bring high levels of observability to space? So that's really where this Tanzu advanced suite of capabilities that we've introduced and we're making a lot of noise about in the January timeframe come to bear. But then for most enterprise organizations, it's also a question of like, how do we deliver that highest abstraction first experience? When you're dealing with a large number of developers, and some of our customers have not just tens or hundreds of thousands, but in some cases, tens of thousands of developers that they're looking to make productive, it's very beneficial to have a controlled environment, have an opinion around what that template looks like from a starting point, what set of application pieces can be delivered to them, how to create rich stewardship around those pieces, making sure that they're operating within the parameters, but can elegantly break loss when they need to, which is where that Tanzu application service capability fits in. And the great news is that we're bringing this all together in a very principled, layered, and well-harmonized stack. So if you look at our future direction around all these technologies, they fit together well. It's offered up in a modular form factor so that you don't necessarily have to approach an organization and say, rewrite everything. You know, there's always going to be that existing system that is a monolith, that it doesn't necessarily make sense to go through a full refactoring exercise. There's always going to be some components of your workflow that you want to preserve, the Jenkins pipeline or something else. And so the Tanzu suite is really about bringing this together. And at the same time, establishing a set of commonalities that enable organizations to operate at scale, common identity, common policy, coordinated operations, a common developer experience, and increasingly a set of foundational services, whether those are database services that can be delivered at a variety of levels of the stack. So they could be running, you know, right directly on the metal with something like a VCF-based offerings, so you can get towards that RDS-like experience the cloud providers offer, or within the context of a Kubernetes cluster itself. And this has to be tied together with a control plane. Our customers are living in an increasingly complex world where it's not just about 1 or 10 or 100, but in some cases with our customers, it's tens of thousands of Kubernetes clusters when they look at those edge deployments. How do you start to treat that as a well-connected computational fabric? And so Mission Control provides a SaaS-based control plane with optional local control capabilities for situations where you have to run in air-gapped environments that really ties this all together. And of course, enables us to walk the journey with customers by integrating it into our vRealize suite. Next slide, please. And so in closing, you know, one of the things that I implore folks to think about is, again, we're not your grandfather's VMware at this point. We're making considerable investments in a lot of different areas that are really about bringing that infrastructure technology in a normalized and highly consumable cloud-centric way to teams, but also providing all of the pieces they need to be able to achieve more efficient inner-loop development practices. So getting going quicker, having access to shared development environments, getting a robust set of templates that can get them going with high levels of scrutiny from folks like enterprise architects, so that when you build something, it's designed to fit into that infrastructure environment. It carries along all of the context that's necessary to be able to run and operate it. Access to some new and really interesting cloud native patterns. I get asked a lot about things like, what is our serverless strategy? You may not know this, but a lot of the founders of things like the Key Native project are working on my team at this point and are working day and night to bring those capabilities to this well-layered and structured stack. And at the end of the day, it's really about that outer loop as well. How do you set your team up for success How do you start moving into a world where you look at software delivery as a supply chain set of outcomes, and getting into that production environment with as little friction as possible, with high levels of optionality, but ultimately having all the piece parts you need to support both application development, application operations, and the infrastructure operations that you need. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for your time. Last slide. And I'll hand it off to the next speaker.
Thank you, Craig. When the godfather of Kubernetes says this is not your grandfather's VMware any longer, that statement has significant weight. Really appreciate your support, Craig.